Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Varsity Tutors StarCourse series, where today's class will take us on a journey over 200 years back in time to explore what life might have been like as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Now, we're joined today by Maryland Center for History and Culture educator Tyler Osborne, who's going to give us a look inside the lives of Continental soldiers during the Revolutionary War and what life would have been like in their weathered shoes. Now, before we get started, this is a live lesson, so we want to interact and participate as much as possible. Throughout the lesson, you may find you have some questions, and Tyler will probably have some questions for you as well. So feel free to use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen to both ask and answer questions throughout the lesson. If we don't get to those questions right away, we are going to be saving about 10 minutes at the close of the lesson, specifically for Q&A. You also want to be sure that you have your camera close by, because toward the end of the lesson, we're going to have the opportunity to lean into the screen and pose for a selfie. And if you tag us here at Varsity Tutors, as well as the Maryland Center, you'll be entered to win a 1-month subscription to a virtual summer camp. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that prize and some of the specifics on how to enter toward the end of the lesson. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and pass things along to Tyler with the Maryland Center for History and Culture.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler, like Haley said, and it is wonderful to be with you today. And I am visiting you from the Maryland Center of History and Culture, and we are located in Baltimore, Maryland. So it is afternoon for me here, but I'm not sure what time it is there. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is wonderful to have you with us today. And like Haley said, I will be talking about the Revolutionary War and specifically the lives of those Revolutionary War soldiers and what life was like in those 1770s and 1780s. Wonderful. And I have a lot of questions for you. So go ahead, and if you have any ideas to share, if you have any answers, go ahead and put them in the chat. And I love to hear that. And we're going to go ahead and get started by looking at this illustration right here. So this illustration shows us all the different types of people who were fighting in the Revolutionary War. So we see this figure right here, and his outfit might look a little funny, and that's because he's actually not wearing a uniform. So we see this figure right over here and this figure over here, and they're wearing uniforms, but this guy's not really. So actually what he's wearing is he's wearing exactly what was in his closet. So when the Revolutionary War started in the 1770s, there were a lot of men who just joined on a whim. They weren't soldiers, they were just civilians. So they just grabbed whatever they had in their closet and went on to war. And I don't know about you, but I definitely don't have anything in my closet ready for war. And so we see figures like this who might have a fur, might have some leggings on, things like that. So they're dressed very, very differently. And we see this figure right over here, and we can tell by the color of his skin that it wasn't just people of European descent fighting in the Revolutionary War. It was there were African and African Americans fighting during the war, and they actually fought on both sides. And so this illustration is a wonderful example to show us all the different types of people who were fighting in the war, including this guy right here in this uniform, which is really important because we have a similar uniform in our collection here at this museum. So this uniform is special in a lot of different ways. But first, I want you to take a guess. What side of the Revolutionary War do you think this person fought for? So we'll talk a little bit about those groups who fought in the war, but I just want you to take a guess first. Who do you think wore this uniform? And I'll give you a hint. We want to look at the color of this uniform. So it might be a little hard to see, but it might look black, but this uniform is actually a dark blue. And so if you kind of think, maybe the British were known as something, a lot of people would call them the Redcoats. So the British wore red during the Revolutionary War, but the colonists or the Americans, they were the ones who wore blue. So we see in this image, this uniform is a dark navy blue color, telling us that this was worn by an American colonist, part of that Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. So if you guessed an American, if you guessed a patriot, wonderful job. That's exactly who this belonged to. And This actually belonged to a higher ranking person in the military. So this belonged to an officer who was pretty high up in the ranks of the military, and that is who this belonged to. And we actually can identify the man who wore this uniform, and his name was Tench Tillman. And we talk about that man here in our museum because he was a Marylander. So he was someone from the state of Maryland who fought during the Revolutionary War, and he was an officer during the war. And so there are actually only three officers' uniforms left in the world today. And we have one here in our museum. And then the other two live at the Smithsonian Museums over in Washington, D.C. So it's incredibly special that we have this in our museum, not only because there are so few left in the world today, but also because we can identify who wore this uniform, and we can actually see him here in this painting. Now, I'm gonna zoom in for us real quick, and I want you to take a guess. Who is that figure in the middle? Who do you think this guy is right here? Does he look familiar? You might see him on a coin or a dollar bill. So I see some of you might have guessed George Washington, and that's exactly who this is. So this is General George Washington, and he led the army during the Revolutionary War. So he is featured very, very prominently in this painting. And then over here to George Washington's side, in this side of the painting right here, we see that this is actually Tench Tillman. So the man who wore that uniform that I just showed you, we can see him in this painting here. And you might notice he has some papers in his hand. And so he has this nice scroll in his hand. And so these papers are actually the acts of capitulation. And so what that means is that these are the paintings that, or these are the papers that ended the Revolutionary War. So Tench Tillman is seen here carrying a very, very important document in American history, as he was a very important figure. And these are the papers that ended that Revolutionary War. And remind us, who won the Revolutionary War? Who won? I'm seeing a lot of people saying America won, and that's exactly right. That is why we are the United States of America today, and we don't have much association with England or the United Kingdom. And so, and thanks to Tench Tillman and George Washington, we are independent today. So I want to go over a little bit more background information about who were the three main groups involved in the Revolutionary War. So who are the three main groups? If you have a friend next to you, if you have any family next to you, or your classroom, go ahead and talk. Who are those three main groups? And you can put them in the chat if you want. So I see that we have the colonies. Wonderful. We have those colonists like George Washington, we like Tench Tillman. So we have the colonists. Awesome. I'm seeing that we have the British. Perfect. And that third group, we have to think really, really hard. Who was that third group? So there were Native Americans who were fighting in the Revolutionary War. They were actually fighting on both sides. But there was another country that was fighting, and it was in Europe. I'm seeing some people say it. That was the French. So France was a country that played a very important role in the Revolutionary War, and we will talk about why in just a second. First, let's talk about why were the colonists fighting? Why were they fighting during the Revolutionary War? So they were definitely fighting for freedom and independence from England. Perfect. And they were really mad at the British for some reason. They were mad because they were doing something but weren't getting something in return. And they had this phrase that they would say very, very frequently. Do we know what that phrase would be? Wonderful. I see someone said it. No taxation without representation. So what that meant is that the colonists, they were paying all of this money. Some of you may have heard like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. So they were paying all of this money to the British, but they weren't getting any representation in British government or in Parliament. So they were mad that they were paying this money but weren't getting anything in return. And would that make you feel good or would that make you feel bad? How would that make us feel? I think it would make us feel very, very bad. So luckily today we have that freedom and independence from Britain, and we actually have our own representation here in America. So we pay our taxes, and then in return we get our state legislators go to our state capitals and they represent us there. And then we also have our legislators that go to Washington, D.C. to represent us in the Capitol. So there's a lot of representation that happens in our government today, in thanks to the Revolutionary War. Now, why were the British fighting? So they were benefiting a lot from having the colonies. So they wanted that power and the land, because a lot of power and land came from this new world in America. So that's why they wanted to keep it. But then they were also getting another thing. So they were getting something from all of these taxes. So they were getting money, but they needed that money for some reason. Do we know why? Britain had just spent a lot of money on something. Does someone want to take a guess and put it in the chat? Talk to your friends and family. I see a couple people guessing it. So it's the French and the Indian War. The French and Indian War played a huge part in the Revolutionary War. It happened a few years prior to the war, and Britain had won that war. So Britain won the French and Indian War. And one thing that's always been true throughout history and is still true today is war is expensive. War is very, very expensive, especially if you win that war, which Britain did. So they had spent all of this money winning the war, and they needed to pay off that money. So they needed all of this money from the colonists. So they were very, very motivated to win the Revolutionary War. Perfect. Now, why were the French fighting? We just talked about something that Britain had to do with France. Perfect. So the French had just lost the French and Indian War, and they had lost to Britain. So the British and the French have had a very, very long history of, there's been a lot of tension, there's been a lot of arguments and disagreements between the two countries. So France was pretty mad at Britain for losing the French and Indian War. And when you're mad at someone, sometimes you want to do something to them. What do we think they wanted to do to Britain? They wanted revenge. So France was really, really mad at the British, and so they formed an alliance with the colonists, and they helped the colonists fight the British and win that war, which was a huge act of revenge for the French, which made them feel a little bit better about losing the French and Indian War. Wonderful. So now that we have a really good understanding of that background of the Revolutionary War, a lot of times we have to ask, how do we learn about history? So I'm a historian, and how do I learn about history? And we learn from primary sources. So we're going to go over a few primary sources today. So you all are going to think like a historian. You're going to take my job, and we're going to figure out more about the lives of revolutionary soldiers. And so we're going to go through some examples of primary sources, work together, see what we can learn about them, and then we're going to apply what we learned to the Revolutionary War. All right. So first, we're going to take a look at this written document right here. So I know behind me, it's kind of hard to read. So it's typed out on your screen right over here. So I want you to skim through that and see if you can figure out, what kind of document is this? What kind of document is this? And some of you might have one yourself. You might write in it from time to time, and you might want to keep it a little bit secret, a little bit hidden. Yeah, this is a diary, or this is a journal. So this is a diary of a young lady. We see her age up here. She is 14 years old when she is writing this. And how do we know that this is from the past? There's something also written in the corner. What do we think that is? It's the date. Yeah, we see this date right over here. So this diary is from 1881, making this 141 years old. So it's really, really special that we can look at this document and learn about this young lady from the 1880s. And maybe you yourself are 14 years old. So you can learn about what life was like for someone just your age 141 years ago. So I think that's pretty cool. And then we're also going to take a look at another handwritten document. Now, this is a letter, and we can see that because we see those words, Dear John. And the same way that we saw the date on the diary, we look at that date, or we look at that date. So this is 1812, telling us that this document is 210 years old, which is even older than that diary we just saw. So this is another really, really old document that we have here in our museum that's really special, and we can learn a lot about the past from these handwritten documents. And now we're going to take a look at this historical photograph. Now, I love looking at historical photographs. I think they're really, really fun. And so I want us to take a look. And what do you think is happening here? What do we think is happening? And there might be a few hints on the banners back here. So what do we think is happening? Yeah, so this is a march for the women's right to vote. So it's not necessarily a parade. It's kind of similar though. So this is a march or a protest for women's right, or the women's right to vote. And we can see that in that banner right here, the ones back here, and this one right up front and center for us, that this is telling us that this is a protest for women's suffrage, or the women's right to vote. And how do we know that this image is from the past? What are some of the clues that tell us that this image is from the past? What do we think? So it's black and white, absolutely. The coloring will usually tell us that it's from the past. Perfect, black and white. What they're wearing, yeah, what they're wearing. A lot of us don't really dress like this today, so that this tells us that this is probably from the past. And there's one more thing. And I want us to think about what has changed since this photo was taken. What do we think? Can women vote today? Yeah, absolutely. Women can vote today. And so since we know that women can vote today, and here in America, we don't have the need to protest for the right to vote, we know that this is from the past because over 100 years ago, women didn't have that right. So over 100 years ago, and this photograph is from about 1909. So in 1909, women needed to protest for the right to vote. And so since that has changed, that's one thing that tells us that this is from the past. And same thing with paintings. So paintings existed, or tell us what things looked like before we had photographs. And so we love to look at photographs or paintings. And I will tell you that this is a painting of downtown Baltimore. And Baltimore certainly does not look like this anymore. So that tells us that this is from the past. And so Baltimore is a lot wider. It's a lot taller now. So it looks very, very different. All right, so we worked through some of those primary sources, and we're going to take a look at one more. So this is another really, really fun one. So these are examples of artifacts. Now I want us to take a look, and I also want someone to take a guess. What does the word artifact mean? What does that word mean? So some people saying it's something from the past. Yeah. And it's specifically an object from the past. So it's something like 3D or physical, and something specifically man-made. And so this is a great example of artifacts that we have here in our collection. And I want us to work together real quick. What do we think we're looking at here? What do we think this is? And I'll give you a hint. All three of these objects, they work together in some way. So what do we think this could be? So absolutely, this is a brush right here. So this is a brush. And it's not quite makeup, but you do use it on a person's face. So we're getting close. not necessarily face paint or powder. And I want us to think about the men in your lives, maybe your uncles, your grandfathers, your brothers, your fathers. They would probably use this more than women. So what do we think? Yeah, it's for your beard. It's for it. This is a shaving kit. So we see this brush right here, and you get the brush wet, and then this is soap in a box up here. And then this is a mirror. So you look in the mirror and see where you need to shave, and then you use the brush and the soap to shave. And the only thing we are missing in this photograph is the razor blades. So these are great examples of artifacts that we have in our collection that historians use to learn about the past. And you are already thinking like historians. And so we are going to use those skills that we just learned and learn more about Revolutionary War soldiers. And specifically, we are going to talk about what they carried in their haversack. Now, I want you to take a guess and put it in the chat, talk to your friends and family and classmates. What do you think a haversack is? And that the end of that word might kind of give you a hint. If it's a sack. So some of you are kind of on the right track. So it's like a bag. So we see this haversack right here. So this is what a Revolutionary War soldier would have carried. So this is like a messenger bag. So you would use this strap and put it on your shoulder and carry it around. And then we have the flap right here, and you would put all of your belongings right in there. Now, tell me, do you think you would be able to carry all of your belongings in this bag? Do you think everything you have would fit here? I certainly do not think so. I have a lot of stuff, and I would need a little bit more space to carry my things than this bag. But the Revolutionary War soldiers, they had to use this bag to carry every single thing that they had. And we're actually going to take a look at some of the things that they carried. So let's take a look. And the first object we're going to look at is similar to the shaving kit in that it's 3 objects and they all work together. So I want us to work through these and figure out what these objects are. And we are going to do that by first describing these objects. So kind of take note, what are some descriptor words or some adjectives to describe these objects? So I think that this one's like a little squishy. It's brown. It's kind of stringy. And then this is black. And this is a kind of rock. And then this is made out of metal. So this is kind of shiny. And it's round and really hard. So how do we think these 3 objects would work together? And I'll show you, you would actually put this around your hand just like that. So what do we think? I see some guesses that, yeah, this is used to start a fire. So this is a Tinder Kit. That's what the soldiers would call it. They would call it a Tinder Kit, and they would use it to start fires. So this is your flint right here, and then this is your steel, and this is wool. And so you would actually use this wool as kindling. So you would wear the steel just like that and hold the flint there, and then strike the flint with the steel and then get some sparks, and hopefully those sparks would catch this wool and start a fire. Now, I can't do it to show you right now because that would be pretty dangerous, but I just wanted to show you these objects and how they work together. So we know that a soldier would use this to start a fire. So think of some ways that a soldier would use fire. What do you think they would do with fire? So I see some people saying maybe they would cook with it. Absolutely. They could cook with it. Maybe use it for some sort of communication. And maybe a torch. So to light your way. So they would need it for light. And they would use it for warmth too. So they would use it to cook with, they would use it for warmth, and they would use it for light. So if a soldier needed fire for all of those things, what does that tell us about their lives? If they needed light, they needed warmth. Do you think that meant that they were sleeping in big, comfy houses all the time? No, of course not. So, and a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers, they didn't even sleep in tents. So they would sleep under the stars and they needed a way to stay warm. And they would use a fire and then they would make some really good campfire meals. And then they would use it for light if they wanted to play some games or things like that while they were waiting or getting ready for bed. They would use a fire. Now, George Washington and Tench Tillman, like we used before, that they were a little bit higher up in the military, so they probably slept in a tent, but most soldiers did not, so they would use a Tinder Kit just like this to start a fire. Wonderful. All right, we're going to take a look at another object, and this one might be kind of tricky. All right. So go ahead and take a look at this. And first, what do you think this is made out of? Or describe it. What are some adjectives? So it has like some sort of stripes here. And it's not super long, about the size of my hand. And it's not bone. This is actually like a deer antler. And it's not super sharp, but it is kind of pointy on both ends because we see that shiny thing right there at the end here. Now, what do we think this could be? So we see this shiny thing, and I'll show you an even closer look at it. So it might be kind of hard to see, but this actually has a hole at the end. So what does that look like to us? Yeah, this is a sewing needle. So this is a sewing needle that's stuck in the antler. There's a piece of cork right there. So you stick it in right there. And then there's string wrapped around this antler. And what do you use a needle and string for? You use it to sew. So this is a 1700s sewing kit. And so this is just a way to store your needle, to store your string. And a soldier would carry this along to sew. Maybe they need to mend their bag or mend their uniforms, things like that. So they would carry a sewing kit with them. And I will tell you that a soldier wouldn't necessarily call this a sewing kit. He would actually call it a housewife, which is kind of a weird term for something like this. So why do we think it was called a housewife? Why do we think? So do you think men were doing a lot of the sewing in the 1770s? No, not really. So sewing was often work that women would do. So maybe mothers, sisters, wives, things like that. So that since sewing was primarily a woman's job, that is why they called this a housewife. And because, do you think their wives were traveling with them during the Revolutionary War to do their sewing for them? No. So they would call this a housewife because their wives weren't with them, their mothers weren't with them to sew for them. So the soldiers actually learned how to sew themselves. And so when they would carry this around with them, they would call it a housewife. Wonderful. So we're going to take a look at a couple more images. I'm going to zoom in for us. And we're going to take a really close look. Now, how would we describe this object? So it's knit. Wonderful. So we see that knitting right there. And it's kind of like gray or brown. And it's kind of squishy, but kind of scratchy too. So not super duper soft. So what do we think this is? It's not gloves. Think about the opposite end of your body if it's not gloves. That makes it socks. Awesome. So these are examples of wool socks. So we see them folded. They're all rolled up here for us. And so soldiers, they always wanted to carry an extra pair of socks to wear on their feet, because what do socks do for us? They keep our feet warm, especially with these wool socks. Wool is very, very warm. So these keep our feet warm. And socks protect our feet, don't they? And soldiers are marching everywhere they go. So they need a lot of protection for their feet. So they would always make sure to carry an extra pair of socks with them, because if they're walking around a lot, do you think that their socks are always in good shape or they're always clean? Are your socks always clean after a day of wearing them? I know sometimes mine aren't, so I will definitely want another pair of socks to make sure that I'm always ready to change if I need to, if they get dirty, if they get some holes in them, and maybe you could even use your housewife to patch up some holes in your socks. And this also tells us about Revolutionary War soldiers, that they weren't really able to buy new things all the time. So they couldn't go to a Target or a Walmart down the street. So they would have to always have a pair of socks with them in case they needed a new pair. Awesome job. So let's take a look at a couple more. And again, I'm going to zoom in for us because this one's a little bit smaller. So let's zoom in a little bit more. All righty. So how would we describe this? So it's black. It's really dark. It's about the size of like a finger. And it's pretty hard. I'll show you. Kind of has an interesting shape where it's kind of pointy on one end and it's kind of squared off. So what do you think this is? And does it look kind of similar to something you already have? What do you think? Pointy on one end. So it's not like a weapon or anything like that. Think about something you write with. Yeah, so this is a pencil. So this is graphite. So this is actually, I have a pencil here for us. So that's actually like what's in our pencils right there. So this is graphite, not necessarily lead, but so this is graphite, and it's this is basically an old pencil. And how would a soldier use pencils? How would they use pencils? Just think, how do we use pencils? We use them to write with, but what do you think they were writing? Maybe notes to their family or their friends. Maybe they were communicating with soldiers elsewhere. And I want us to think too, do you think everyone knew how to read and write in the 1770s? Do you think everyone had the luxury to go to school in the 1770s? No, only really very lucky people could go to school and learn how to read and write. So if a soldier was carrying this specific object, what does that tell us about that soldier? What do we think? Do we think they went to school? Yeah, I think so. So if they're carrying a pencil with them, that probably means that they knew how to read and write, which means that they were educated. Alrighty, we're going to do one last object, and I hope you're ready because I think this is the hardest object of all. So I want you to get ready, everyone. All right, let's take a look. Tell me, what are these? What are these that we're looking at? Yeah, of course, these are playing cards. So we recognize these pretty easily because we use these today. So exactly, these are playing cards, and something might look a little bit different because something's missing. What's missing? Yeah, so we don't really have numbers, or we don't have numbers here. We don't have letters here in the corner. And why do you think that is? We just talked about it with the pencil. What's that connection? Yeah, so they didn't go to school. They didn't really know how to read or write, meaning that they wouldn't know what this meant. They wouldn't know that this meant the number 4, but they could count. So they could count that there were 1, 2, 3, 4 on this card, which tells us that, yeah, absolutely not every soldier was educated. Alrighty, we just went through a lot of very, very cool objects, and you all are already thinking like historians and did a wonderful job doing that. And so that's all I have to share for you. You all learned a lot about Revolutionary War soldiers today. So I know Haley, she has a really exciting opportunity to take a picture with our soldier Tench Tillman here. So get those cameras ready. And then I'm happy to answer some questions. So I will step off screen so you can see our soldier for us.
Now, as you're getting those cameras at the ready, as a quick reminder, if you post these selfies on Instagram and you tag us here at Varsity Tutors, as well as the Maryland Center for History and Culture, I'll have those tags up at the very, very end of the lesson. You'll have the opportunity to win that 1-month subscription to a virtual summer camp. So whether you want to learn more about history in many different periods of time, or perhaps branch out into STEM, dinosaurs, chess, or anywhere in between, there is a virtual summer camp for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get this image front and center. And Tyler, if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about what we're looking at while we snap a couple photos.
Absolutely. So as a quick reminder, so this is a colonist's uniform, and we can tell that by looking at the color of his coat, the color of his hat, and he's wearing that dark blue color, which tells us that this is a colonist or an American soldier uniform. And this uniform is very, very special to us because it belonged to a Marylander named Tench Tillman, and he was an officer during the war, which was a very high-ranking position, and this man knew and worked very closely with George Washington, and it's one of the few officers' uniforms to still exist in the country today. So I hope you all are taking some really, really great selfies with Mr. Tench Tillman here.
Awesome. Thank you. And whenever you're ready to come back on screen, our first question actually deals very directly with what we're looking at. So it's
absolutely
wondering, when you have these artifacts and you can tell all of these amazing stories about the lives of the people that they correspond to, what are some things that we can use? How is it that historians can tell who specifically owned and used some of this stuff?
Yeah, so sometimes it can be a really hard job. So you have to there is some guesswork, but we can look at a lot of those clues to figure out who it belonged to. Sometimes we're really lucky and the family who that object belonged to donates it to a museum. So like Tench Tillman, his family still exists in the state today. And so they are very proud of their heritage and their relationship to Tench Tillman. So we actually, we know about this uniform because we know the Tillman family. But other objects, we might not be able to relate it to one specific person, but we can kind of guess and use those clues that we were working with before, that if someone is carrying a pencil, that means that they're probably writing, they're probably sending messages to people, which tells us that they were probably lucky enough to go to school. So although we might not always have a name to go with something, we can try to figure out a little bit more about their life.
Awesome. Well, that is certainly very fortunate when we are able to see that history, that we've got some folks who are excited enough about the history that they want to share it in the form of a museum or a center for history and culture.
Absolutely. So maybe you have some things in your basement or your attic that belonged to people long ago. So maybe take a look and see if you can find something that you would like to donate to a museum, or at least tell the story of.
Awesome. Very cool. Now we also had, and this is a very, I'm sure, tricky question to answer,
Okay.
but
hopefully I have an answer.
We had some questions around, you mentioned whether it be African Americans, Native Americans, or even those just living as colonists in what we now know as America, that they were fighting on both sides. So why is it that people who were living in America at the time would be motivated to fight what seems to be against their own freedom?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question and can be a little bit tricky. So sometimes during a war, or during the Revolutionary War, there were some different promises happening. So one thing that Britain kind of was promising during the war is that they would offer freedom to enslaved African and African American people, and they would provide more rights to Native Americans and American Indians here in America. So they were kind of making those promises that they would help out those populations and those communities here in America. And so that's one reason that they would fight with the British. But then there are also people, enslaved people, African and African Americans and natives who maybe didn't necessarily believe or trust the British. So they would fight on the side of the colonists. So there was kind of some mixed messaging and maybe some confusion as to what would happen with their futures regarding who won. So there was a lot of different reasons, but there was some confusion, and maybe you thought that one group would help you and one group would not. So that's why you see those different groups fighting on each side.
Wow, definitely a lot more than initially meets the eye.
Yes.
Now, I mentioned that you are a Center for History and Culture. We had some students who are wondering, how would we differentiate a Center for History and Culture from, say, a museum or other types of organizations that house and teach about history?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and kind of one confusing if maybe you're not you're not a historian. So let me try to break it down. So in our museum at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, we have a museum, but we also have a library. So we have a library with a lot of different historical documents and books and things like that. So we're not just a museum. So we want to make sure that people know that we offer a lot more than that. And we do a lot of different education in all sorts of ways, including me visiting you all in your homes, in your classrooms, things like that. So we offer all of these different resources. So we'd like to say that we're more than just a museum, because we're more than just a place that you can visit. We can come to you and wherever you are, because you might be all over the world today, and I get to come to you to talk about Maryland history. So we are more than just one specific museum. We can travel the world with the help of computers and the internet. And we not only talk about history of Maryland or history of America, but we also talk about important things in Maryland culture today. So what's happening within our state, within our country, things like that. So I know that that's kind of tricky because there's a lot of different aspects, but there are a lot of different things that we do, and we want to make sure that we get to tell people.
Awesome. Now we got to explore some of the specifics that we might find in a haversack. And I think perhaps some students at home are all too familiar with the idea that whether it's a purse or a backpack or something they've got, they could dump out and have all sorts of different contents that might be useful on a day-to-day basis. So do you have any favorite things that we might find in a Revolutionary War haversack that we didn't talk about today?
Yeah, so let me see. I actually have another one that I can show us. So this one's just a little bit bigger. So what do we think this is? So if it's round, I'll show you, it has a little hole at the top. Maybe you can see that. And so this is a canteen. So a lot of you might carry a water bottle around with you, and especially you want to make sure you're carrying a reusable water bottle, just like they did with canteens. So that I really like that, because we can see something that we would use just like today that they were doing in the Revolutionary War. They would fill this up in like a river, a lake, wherever they had the chance to, and carry it with them, because if you're walking all the time, you're going to get pretty tired. You're going to get pretty thirsty. So you want to make sure that you're hydrating and staying well hydrated during all of those marches and all of that walking. So that's another really cool object that I like to share, just because it's similar to something that I use every day now. So, and hopefully you all do too.
Absolutely, certainly relatable. And speaking of things that we might find in a haversack, we also had some students who were wondering a little more of the specifics about how museums, how historians, how people end up finding and coming across these artifacts, other than being fortunate enough that it has been given to them by being handed down throughout someone's family.
Yeah, so that is a very lucky case if you can find it in an attic, if you can find it somewhere in your house. But some of these things might be buried somewhere, and especially on like battlefields, a lot of things would get buried. So there are a lot of archaeologists who do a lot of great work where they dig up the ground and see what they can find buried underneath. And which is a lot of fun. And I have had the chance to go on a few archaeological digs to see what I can find and see what historical artifacts are buried underground and what history we can find there. And there's a lot of different archaeological societies and places, I'm sure, in your state or your country that welcome volunteers. So if you're interested in archaeology, you should definitely seek out those opportunities and see what history you can find. You can find yourselves maybe in your own backyard or maybe somewhere close to you.
Wow, what a fantastic segue to my next question, which is we had a lot of students who were wondering some of the more specifics around what they might expect out of a career as a historian. So might it involve things like travel with those archaeological digs? What sorts of things might they be involved in doing? And what sorts of things might they want to study to prepare for a career in this kind of field?
I love that question because obviously I myself studied history and became a historian. And there's a lot of different things that you can do if you're really interested in history. So you can do a lot of research. So maybe you can write books or you can teach. So you can teach in maybe a college or a school. So that's one avenue. You can work in a museum like I am and even maybe work on some exhibits or things like that. Or you could also educate just like I am here within a museum. And yeah, you can dig up the history and see what you can find and tell those additional stories about history that might be buried underground and hidden. And something else that you can do is make sure that you're protecting your resources. So something that's really important is we have a lot of history that we can see every day, whether that's artifacts that you might find somewhere that are in danger of deterioration or rotting, things like that, or it might be an old building. So that's another really important job that historians do is that they make sure that they're preserving and protecting our historical resources that we can still learn from today, but people can learn from in the very distant future. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with a history career if you're very interested. And I encourage you all to do so because I love my job and I hope you all get a chance to do something similar or you get to do something else you love.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much once again, Tyler.
Absolutely.
That does look like about all the time that we have for today. Thank you, everyone who tuned in for asking such wonderful and thoughtful questions. We hope to see you all back in another Varsity Tutors StarCourse soon. But in the meantime, don't forget to post those selfies and tag us. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good day.